Spain, 1611. A woman is being dragged through a crowded marketplace, her wrists bound so tightly the rope has cut through skin, her mouth gagged to silence her screams. The crowd doesn't rush to help her. They part to make way, then close behind her like a tide, following her toward the center of the square. She's not being taken to the gallows, where death comes quickly. She's not being led to a burning stake where smoke might end her suffering before the flames do. She's being taken to something far worse, a device so deliberately cruel that its very design proves someone sat down, thought carefully about how to maximize human suffering, and then built exactly that. In the middle of the plaza sits what looks like a throne, beautiful metalwork, ornate design, almost regal in its appearance. But as you get closer, you notice the hundreds of iron spikes covering every surface, the seat, the back, the armrests, and beneath it, a brazier is already being prepared. Guards lift the woman and force her down onto the spiked surface. Her scream is muffled by the gag as metal punctures her back, her thighs, her arms. The executioner lights the fire below. The smell of burning oil fills the air, then something worse, the smell of cooking flesh. And here's what will truly haunt you. This wasn't a rare atrocity committed by one sadistic individual. This was official policy, sanctioned by church and state, carried out in public squares from Spain to France to the Holy Roman Empire. Women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or even helping other women give birth without a priest's permission were sentenced to die this way, not quickly, but inch by agonizing inch, over hours or even days. Let me be absolutely clear about what made this torture so uniquely horrifying. The iron chair wasn't designed to kill you. It was designed to cook you alive while keeping you conscious for as long as possible. The spikes were short, long enough to pierce flesh and hold you in place, but not long enough to hit vital organs or major arteries. You wouldn't bleed out. You wouldn't go into shock immediately. You would just burn, slowly, from the outside in, while your skin stuck to the heating metal and your body became part of the chair itself. The executioners had refined this into a precise science. They controlled the heat carefully, starting low, letting you feel the warmth gradually increase, giving you time to understand what was happening, to beg through your gag, to thrash against the restraints that only drove the spikes deeper. Some designs included hollow spikes, where boiling oil or water could be injected drop by drop directly into the wounds. Others featured spikes that could be twisted or replaced mid-execution to create fresh pain when the body started going numb. This wasn't impulsive violence born of ignorance or fear. This was systematic torture refined over generations, with modifications and improvements passed down from executioner to executioner, like a family recipe for maximum suffering. But here's what most people never understand about this period in history. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't a handful of deranged individuals acting outside the law. This was the system, blessed by the Catholic Church, enforced by civil authorities, and supported by everyday citizens who would gather to watch. The 1500s and 1600s in Europe existed under what can only be described as a regime of religious terror. The Church didn't just rule spiritual matters, it controlled every aspect of daily life. Witch trials burned across Germany like wildfires. Heresy hunts swept through France. The Spanish Inquisition, that name that still echoes through history as shorthand for institutional cruelty, had reached into every home, every family, every whisper between neighbors. Justice no longer meant finding truth or protecting the innocent. It meant enforcing obedience through fear so profound that people would denounce their own family members rather than risk being accused themselves. A woman who knew herbal medicine could be labeled a witch. A midwife who successfully delivered babies without church supervision could be charged with blasphemy. Even helping another woman during childbirth could be seen as defying God's natural order. The church taught that women were supposed to suffer during birth as punishment for Eve's sin, so anyone who tried to ease that suffering was interfering with divine justice. Can you imagine living in a world where helping someone in pain could get you tortured to death? And the chair itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Heavy forged steel, embedded with hundreds of short spikes positioned at precise angles to cause maximum pain without causing quick death. The entire structure could weigh several hundred pounds, making escape impossible even if you somehow got free of the restraints. Beneath the seat, a small furnace or charcoal pan allowed executioners complete control over the temperature. They could turn the agony up or down like adjusting an oven, prolonging the suffering for hours. Every moan, every involuntary twitch, every moment of blistering agony was part of the message being sent. Because this wasn't just punishment for an individual, it was performance art designed to terrorize an entire population. Public squares became stages for these spectacles. Church bells rang to summon villagers from surrounding areas. Markets closed so everyone could attend. Children were brought by their parents and told to watch carefully, to remember what happens to people who disobey church authority. Priests stood beside the burning chair, delivering sermons, telling the assembled crowd that this was purification, that pain was burning sin away, that this torture was an act of love meant to save the victim's soul by destroying her body. But the truth was far simpler and infinitely darker. This wasn't about purifying sin. It was about multiplying fear. Every execution sent ripples of terror through communities. Even people who never witnessed a burning firsthand heard about it from neighbors, imagined it in nightmares, felt those phantom spikes pressing into their own backs whenever they considered speaking out against injustice. One woman's torment became a lesson for thousands. One scream echoed through entire regions. That's how the system worked. It didn't need to torture everyone, just enough people, publicly enough, brutally enough, that everyone else stayed silent. And here's the detail that makes this even more chilling. The agony didn't end when the fire finally stopped or when the victim's heart gave out. It was what happened afterward that reveals the true systematic nature of this horror. Most victims' names were deliberately erased from records. Churches kept meticulous financial records and property documents, but somehow lost the documentation about who was tortured and why. Graves went unmarked. Families were forbidden from mourning publicly. The church labeled these women as sinners, and history quietly obeyed for centuries. But not all traces could be erased. A few stories clawed their way out of the ashes, surviving in the margins of official documents, in letters hidden in walls, in sketches made by witnesses who couldn't stay silent. One of those stories comes from southern France in 1627. A woman named Margarite Blanc lived in a small town where she was known as someone who grew medicinal herbs in her garden. When a nobleman's son fell ill and died, grief-stricken parents needed someone to blame. Marguerite's herb garden became evidence of witchcraft. There was no proof she'd poisoned anyone. In fact, there was no proof the boy had been poisoned at all. He might have died from any number of common illnesses that killed children in that era. But whispers that she used devil's herbs were enough. Her sentence was read publicly: purification by holy fire. They stripped her naked and tied her to the iron chair in the town square, while hundreds watched. The executioner lit the coals beneath the seat and the ritual began. For 4 hours, the fire consumed her slowly, systematically. The heat rose in waves. Her skin blistered, blackened, cracked. The spikes held her in place as she tried to writhe away from the burning metal. The crowd watched in what official records describe as reverent silence, though you have to wonder what was really going through their minds. But Marguerite didn't die quietly, and she didn't die broken. Witnesses said that in her final moments, as her lungs were failing and her voice was nearly gone, she lifted her blistered head and whispered words that would haunt that town forever. "I am not your lesson. I am your sin." Those words never made it into the official church record of her execution. The priest who presided over her death certainly didn't include them in his report. But a 17-year-old scribe named Etienne Caron, who was there to take notes, scribbled them into the margin of his notebook. He hid that notebook for the rest of his life, and when he died, his daughter hid it in a chapel wall. It wasn't discovered until 1892, 2.5 centuries later during renovations. Today, that notebook sits under protective glass in the Toulouse Historical Archives. Faded ink, cracked leather, the edges singed with time. Marguerite's body was burned until nothing remained. Her name was erased from official records, but her words survived, floating through history like smoke that refused to dissipate, and she wasn't alone. For every Margarite who spoke final words of defiance, there were hundreds who never got the chance, whose voices were stolen by smoke inhalation or pain so extreme their minds broke before their bodies did. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these executions wasn't the torture itself, it was the audience. Because while flames consumed one body, the eyes of hundreds devoured her soul, and her suffering became their entertainment. These weren't secret late-night burnings hidden away in dungeons. They were public events, carefully organized, timed, and advertised. Notices would be posted in town squares days in advance. Church bells rang to signal the start of executions. Markets closed specifically so everyone could attend. Vendors set up stalls around the execution site selling bread, fruit, and wine. The smell of smoke from the burning chair mixed with the aroma of roasted chestnuts and spilled wine. Children stood on their parents' shoulders to get better views. Noble families reserved balcony seats overlooking the square, their servants shading them with parasols as they sipped wine and watched women burn. They called these events chair days, actual festivals built around slow death. In some cities, multiple women would be sentenced on the same day, creating an all-day spectacle where one victim would be burning in the square while another was being judged in a nearby hall, waiting for her turn. Priests delivered sermons between screams. Children were told to watch and remember so they would never dare disobey. The most disturbing part was how ordinary it all became. Witnesses from Genoa and Verona described crowds laughing and joking between the victims' screams, families having picnics while the iron glowed red, nobles making bets on how long each woman would survive. Some accounts describe musicians playing during executions to mask the sounds of suffering, not out of mercy, but because the screams were apparently disturbing people's appetites. This was torture as public theater, suffering as entertainment, death as a festival. And the people participated willingly, gathering their children, packing lunches, making a day of it. Yet not everyone was blind to the horror. In Verona in 1654, on the night before a scheduled execution, someone nailed a letter to the cathedral door. It read, "You have turned pain into prayer, but fire burns more than bodies. It burns the soul of a people." No one ever claimed responsibility for that letter. No one was punished for posting it. But the next day, something shifted. The crowd that gathered for the execution was quieter than usual. There was no cheering, no laughter. Some people turned their faces away. It didn't stop the flames or save that woman's life, but it planted a seed, the first crack in the spell of fear that had held entire populations captive. Historians now believe that what eventually ended the use of the iron chair wasn't new laws or sudden moral awakening, it was exhaustion. The crowd's appetite for horror finally began to fade. The sermons lost their grip on people's minds. When fear stopped working as a control mechanism, the fire lost its power. But before that happened, there was one more name that the flames refused to erase completely. One woman whose story outlasted the ashes, and whose death sparked something that authorities never intended. Her name was Isidora Alvarado, and in 1,671 inches, Valencia, Spain, she was known as La Madre de Madres, the Mother of Mothers. She was the most respected midwife in the city, trusted by families rich and poor. She'd brought hundreds of babies safely into the world. But one night, a young mother came to her in desperation and confessed something that would doom them both. A priest named Father Emiliano Ruiz had assaulted her during confession. The young woman was traumatized, pregnant from the assault, and terrified. Isidora faced a choice: stay silent and complicit, or speak truth and face consequences she knew would be severe. She chose truth. She didn't whisper the accusation in private corners. She accused Father Ruiz publicly, in front of witnesses, demanding he face justice for his crime. 3 days later, the Inquisition came for her. The charges were heresy, defamation of a holy servant, and use of forbidden herbs, the standard accusations that could mean anything and required no proof. The punishment, execution by the iron chair. But this time, the church wanted silence. No public spectacle, no crowds, no market vendors. In a crypt beneath the church of San Isidro, an iron chair was prepared, spiked, polished, waiting in torchlight. Only 14 witnesses were allowed: the executioner, church officials, and Father Emiliano Ruiz himself, the priest she'd accused. They stripped her, bound her wrists and ankles with iron clamps, and forced her onto the cold metal. The brazier beneath was lit, but not steadily. The executioner had been instructed to starve the fire, then feed it suddenly, creating cycles of freezing cold followed by sudden waves of blistering heat. This refinement in torture technique was designed to prevent the body from adapting to consistent pain. Isidora lasted 8 hours. 8 hours of alternating between shivering cold that made the spike wounds even more agonizing and sudden heat that made her skin stick to the metal. The priest who read her final rites, who stood there reciting prayers while she burned, was Father Emiliano Ruiz, the very man she'd accused of assault. When it was finally over, the inquisitors did something unprecedented. They didn't remove her body from the chair. Her flesh, fused to the glowing iron, was left to cool and harden in place. Her body blackened, her face twisted beyond recognition, became part of the chair itself. They sealed the chamber with stone and carved a phrase in Latin above the door, Memento audere, remember, to speak is to suffer. For more than a century, that chamber remained hidden, the church above it falling into disrepair as Spain's power declined and the Inquisition's influence waned. The world forgot about Isidora, forgot about that sealed crypt, forgot about the woman who'd been literally melted into a torture device for telling the truth. Until 1813, when French soldiers looting Valencia during the Napoleonic invasions broke through the altar wall and discovered something that made even hardened military men recoil in horror. The iron chair was still there, and Isidora was still bound to it. Her body had mummified in the sealed chamber, remaining almost intact for 142 years. Her skin was fused to the metal. Her mouth was still open in what must have been her final scream. Her hands were still clenched around the armrests where spikes had gone through her palms. Before the soldiers burned the church, which they did immediately, horrified by what they'd found, one of them, a young artist named Julian Korb, quickly sketched what he saw. A rough, haunting drawing showing a woman and a chair merged into one impossible form, surrounded by Latin carvings and centuries of candle soot. That sketch survives to this day, preserved in the French Army archives in Paris. It's just fragile paper and faded black ink, but it's a ghost that refused to die. Isidora's body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave. The chair itself was melted down for cannon shot. But Julian Korb's drawing remains, and with it comes a question that still burns through time. What happens to a society that punishes truth with fire? What happens when speaking up against powerful men's crimes means torture and death? What happens when entire communities not only accept this, but participate in it, bringing their children to watch, packing picnics, making entertainment from suffering? The iron chair was never designed to kill quickly. Every aspect of its construction was meant to break the body first, then the will, to transform one person's agony into a lesson for thousands. For centuries, it worked. Every scream became law. Every burn scar became precedent. Every silence became submission. Generations of people believed that fear equaled safety, that cruelty equaled righteousness, that this systematic torture was actually protecting them from evil. And here's what we need to understand. The people who built these chairs, who lit the fires, who carved to speak is to suffer above sealed chambers, they weren't monsters from fairy tales. They were ordinary humans who'd been taught that obedience to authority mattered more than compassion, that maintaining power structures was more important than protecting the innocent, that fear was a valid tool for social control. But Isidora's story survived for one crucial reason. Someone, somewhere in the chain of horror, refused to forget. Etienne Caron kept his notebook with Margarite's final words. Julian Korb made his sketch, even though it would haunt him forever. Anonymous rebels posted letters on cathedral doors, and slowly, painfully slowly, the spell of fear began to break. These stories remind us of something vital. Torture doesn't need iron or flame to exist. It only needs obedience. It needs people willing to look away, to stay silent, to prioritize their own safety over someone else's suffering. We like to tell ourselves that humanity has moved beyond this, that such horrors are relics of a darker time safely behind us. But look closer at our world. Where do we still punish people slowly? Where do we still make examples of them in front of crowds, even if those crowds are now digital? Where does shame still burn hotter than truth? Where are people still afraid to speak up about powerful individuals' crimes because they know the consequences will destroy them? The tools have changed. The stage looks different. We don't have iron chairs heated by braziers anymore. But do we still have systems that silence victims? Do we still have structures that protect powerful perpetrators? Do we still have communities that would rather maintain comfortable lies than face uncomfortable truths? The real fire was never under the chair. It was always inside the crowd, in their willingness to watch, to participate, to accept horror as normal. And that fire hasn't been fully extinguished. It's still burning in every system that prioritizes power over justice, in every institution that protects abusers, in every community that silences victims. Remembering Isidora, Margarite, and the countless unnamed women who died in those chairs isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about recognizing that the capacity for systematic cruelty still exists, and that our vigilance is the only thing standing between civilization and the return of those flames. If this history disturbs you, if it makes you question how societies justify cruelty and how ordinary people become complicit in horror, then subscribe to Flow of History. We're committed to uncovering these difficult truths because understanding how oppression worked in the past is essential to recognizing it in the present. Hit that notification bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and join us as we continue exploring the shadows where real history lives. Remember, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And this is history we cannot afford to forget.
God help me, I was so afraid.
It is over.
You are safe here with me.
The liver, positioned thus beneath the ribs, purifies the blood.
Observe the intricate details of the